Morning, everyone, from wherever you are joining. So today we have Professor Bobby Zhou with us. He's a professor of marketing at University of Maryland Smith School of Business. I'll justly talk about his research area. So his research focuses on the manner in which competition affects a firm's marketing strategy, particularly as it pertains to its pricing decisions. He draws inspiration from problems that arise in the real world, right, for which the best practice solution can be improved. He does this by incorporating the tools of analytical models and experimental design, which help managers understand the theoretical underpinnings of the problem in hand. Also, he works on questions like when and why should service providers allow consumers to bundle themselves into family plans, or important questions like how can firms achieve higher profits through trade-in and trade-up promotion. He also enjoys incorporating consumers' behavioral biases into an analytic framework, and then that allows him to understand the optimal policy for the firm. And he also has teaching interests in that area: market research, marketing strategy, pricing, and marketing of high technology products. We are very glad to have Professor Zhou with us. He agreed to our invitation, and we are very thrilled to have him. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to.
All right, thank you so much, Anuj, for this wonderful introduction. I'm gonna jump right in. First of all, thank you all very much for inviting me here. It's a great honor to present in front of the great IIM audience. Today, I'm going to share with you all one recent working project. The title is called Search Neutrality and the Competition Between First-Party and Third-Party Sales. This is joint work with Tianxin Zhou from University of Florida. Okay, first, I would like to show you some interesting data. This is taken from Amazon.com. We can see that there is intense competition between first-party products, which are Amazon's own branded products, and third-party products that are being sold on Amazon. In fact, we can see that, for example, in the category of books, almost 2/3 of the books sold on Amazon are published by Amazon itself. And they're competing with books published by other publishers, right, which we call third-party products. And depending on the category, it can be anywhere between 28%, such as soft lines like T-shirts, pants, and so on and so forth, all the way up to 3/4, which are books, right? And the whole point of this table is to say that the competition between first-party and third-party products on Amazon is pretty intense. And in many categories, Amazon's first-party products or services have occupied a very prominent position. In a recent survey, you can see that almost 60% of third-party sellers that are interviewed have expressed their significant concerns about Amazon's self-preference in this competition between first-party and third-party product. What does that mean? The next slide shows you that, according to some of the reporters, this unique and competitive advantage of Amazon is as follows, where when multiple products are competing or being displayed on the same web page, Amazon could always put its own product first, right? And in one example, the markup found that Amazon-owned cereal with 4 stars and over 1,000 ratings actually appeared ahead of a national brand, a national competitor with a better rating and many, many more consumer reviews, right? And unfortunately, the same survey also find that a lot of consumers are not aware of the pattern that Amazon actually prioritizes its own products over competitors. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, does this only apply to Amazon.com? Actually, it applies more broadly in a lot of platform situations. For example, in the Apple's ecosystem, in App Store, right? When consumers search the key term Dropbox, the first item they actually saw was not Dropbox. It was Apple's own first-party app files. And because of that, Dropbox actually have filed a lawsuit against Apple, right? Accusing Apple of self-preferencing its own first-party product. And similarly, Google has also been accused of favoring its own first-party services over that of the third-party services. And there are some lawsuits that are currently ongoing. So you can see that this self-preferencing applies anywhere the platform itself engages in any type of self-preferencing behavior when it competes directly with third-party products or services. Now, before I move on, I would like to introduce you all this concept called search neutrality. This search-neutrality.org is a prominent consumer rights advocate. And on this slide, I have quoted their exact definition of what search neutrality is. Basically, the concept of search neutrality means that any search engines should have no editorial policies other than that their results be comprehensive, impartial, and based solely on relevance. Here, I really want to highlight the keyword relevance, right? So if you think Dropbox is more relevant when consumers search for Dropbox, then Dropbox should appear first in Apple's App Store when consumers search for that key term. In particular, the direct implication of search neutrality is that retail platforms such as Amazon, Google, JD.com, and any other major online retail platforms should not treat their own first-party products more favorably over their third-party competitors in the search rankings. Okay. All right. Now, before I show you my research questions, I wanted to provide you with some contextual information. First, I would like to start with European Union's Digital Markets Act, DMA. In fact, DMA was just passed in the European Commission, in European Union, a couple of months ago, and it will be signed into law next month in October, right? And here I've highlighted one central takeaway from DMA, Digital Market Act, which is gatekeeper platforms should not treat services and products offered by the platform itself more favorably in ranking than similar services or products offered by third parties on the gatekeeper's platform. In other words, this law, right, this soon-to-be law is going to prohibit Amazon from displaying Amazon first-party products ahead of its competitors' products if relevance is accounted for. Now, the second piece of contextual information I wanted to share with you is from the US. The US has American Innovation and Choice Online Act, so-called IIMA. And this act has similar policies, which states that the platform should not unfairly preference its own products, services, or line of businesses over those of another business user on the focal platform in a manner that would materially harm competition on the focal platform. Here, I'm going to quote Senator John Kennedy, who is a major sponsor of IIMA. So Senator Kennedy says that the American Innovation and Choice Online Act would help offer consumers more options at competitive prices from business online. Okay, I want to draw your attention to the underlying phrase, which is help offer consumers more options at competitive prices. Later on, I'm going to revisit this sentence and show you when it does not hold. Okay. All right, now I'm going to talk about my research question. You have seen European Union's Digital Market Act. You have seen Americans' IIMA. You have seen some examples where major retail platforms have been accused of favoring their own products and services over that of the third parties. Inspired by those observations, I asked one central research question in this paper, which is, how will search neutrality influence retail platforms, third-party sellers, as well as consumers? Specifically, there are two different types of impact in this setting. The first is direct impact. So once search neutrality has been signed into law, for example, immediately we can see that the search relevance, right, when consumers start their search process, would increase. And then as a direct result, third-party sellers will be more fairly treated. Those are all great news. That being said, there is another more subtle influence, which is the indirect impact. The indirect impact goes as follows. With search neutrality, both first-party and third-party sellers will strategically adjust their price. As a result, search neutrality could even influence the focal platform's decision of whether or not to allow third-party sellers to enter their platform by adjusting their commission rate. And this problem, particularly this indirect impact, has not yet been considered by regulators, legislators, or the prior research. And this is where our intended contribution will be for this paper. We're going to account for both the direct impact and indirect impact in search neutrality's implementation. All right, before I get into the nitty-gritty details of the model, first, I would like to give you a very brief highlight of the major findings of this paper. So two central findings. Number one, with personalized search rankings, search neutrality can actually weaken price competition between first-party and third-party products. And by weakening price competition, I mean the price will go up, okay? Both parties' products prices will go up. And because of the higher prices, consumers might actually be worse off, even though now their search relevance has improved. And next, even though search neutrality is supposed to regulate the underlying platform, right, the so-called dominant platforms, the platform's profit may actually increase despite of their loss of their ability to self-preference. This is the first major result. The second major result is that search neutrality could incentivize the platform to even block the entry of third-party sellers and de facto selling as a local monopoly. As a result, consumers will have fewer choices and higher prices. Now, if you take a look at this highlighted sentence, right, this goes directly against Senator John Kennedy's argument that, hey, search neutrality, or IIMA, is supposed to help consumers with more choices and better prices. And just to sum it up, right, search neutrality has unintended consequences that could harm consumers as well as third-party sellers. All right. That's a very quick overview. Before I move on, I noticed that there's a question.
Yes, Aninto has a question. Aninto, you can unmute.
Hi, Yunus, thanks. Thanks, Professor Zhou. I have a question. So what you are talking about is mostly from the consumer side, right? But can there be a response from the producer side that, so if I am Amazon, and if I know that I have to allow my third-party competitors to sell in the same product category, cannot I just, so let's say there is a focal dimension on which products are being sold, but then I can add some, maybe change the color or add some, product dimensions to it. So I can tweak my product a little bit and claim that this is basically a different product. So can product differentiation come as a response of this, in which case, technically speaking, product spread will increase rather than decrease?
First of all,
then I will be able to have, yeah, please.
I think this is a fantastic question. This is a really, really good question. In reality, this is what third-party sellers should do. First of all, I fully acknowledge that. Secondly, I also want to comment that if you think about it, if you are one of those really smart and strategic third-party sellers, right? And once you tweak your products, you innovate without any external regulation, think about what Amazon would do. I'm not trying to imply that Amazon will exactly copy your design, right? Or your packaging or some of your key new functionalities. But it's likely that the dominant platform, because of their vast superior resources, right, would follow suit and go into this newly created category and start another round of competition with the underlying third-party sellers again. So in other words, while I acknowledge that this is exactly what third-party sellers will do, my response is that as long as there are categories in which the competition between first-party and third-party products are unavoidable, this model would go through, and the main insights would apply. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think part of the assumption is that the products are kind of highly inelastic, so one cannot easily switch. So the competition is sort of unavoidable. I get it. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you. Yeah, please keep those great questions coming. All right. So what's so unique about online retail platforms, right? I'm going to assume that everybody here in the audience is very familiar with online retail platforms. That said, I still wanted to highlight two essential features that distinguish online retail platforms from, for example, offline retail outlets. The first one is the so-called personalization, right? So what Anuj sees from his search query will be potentially different from what Bobby sees from his search queries, right? Now, if you think about the offline retailers, when you shop at Walmart, right, in the local Walmart store, so what Anuj and what Bobby see will be exactly identical, right? A product's prominence applies uniformly across all different consumers. So whichever product has in-store display, you know that that's the more prominent product, right? Number one, personalization. Number two, unlike some of the other retail outlets, in the online retail platforms, I want you to think about Amazon.com, right? Consumers actually see a product's price before they actually search in depth to figure out whether or not this product is a good fit for their preferences. And the fact that they can see the product's price would influence whether or not they're going to search. If you think about it, if they see a bunch of really high prices, then they are less likely to search. If they see relatively low prices, then they are much more likely to engage in further search. All right, and those two unique features of the online retail platforms are going to be both accounted for, and they are going to play a major role in this modeling framework. Just very quickly, I'm going to go through the two streams of literature. The first relevant stream of literature is self-preferencing on retail platforms. This literature is relatively new, but most of the theoretical papers study the so-called extreme self-preferencing, where third-party sellers are completely blocked out of the major online platform. But on the other hand, what I'm going to focus on this paper is a situation where search neutrality concerns contexts where third-party sellers still exist, but they're made less prominent in consumer search rankings. The second relevant stream of literature is so-called ordered consumer search, and there has been many papers on this domain, especially in economics. Ordered search is a pretty hot and growing field. However, the existing research on ordered search focuses on impersonalized search rankings. And in other words, the search rankings are not personalized like what we observe in online retail platforms. In addition, consumers typically don't see prices before they search, right? And those contexts are more applicable in the offline retail setting, not in the online shopping environment. All right, now I'm going to move on to talk about the setup of my model, right? To simplify things, I only consider two sellers. First party seller, which is denoted by this letter F, platform, right? First party. And one third party seller, T. Each sells a product on the platform with zero marginal cost, just to simplify the analysis. And the platform charges third party seller a commission rate R. Think about R being, 15% at Amazon.com, right? And 12%, 10 to 12% at eBay.com. And then a product can either match or mismatch a consumer I's preferences. If a product matches a consumer I's preference, the consumer's valuation for this product, V, will be equal to 1. But if this product is a mismatch with consumer I, then consumer's valuation for the underlying product will be 0. Again, very simple assumptions, right? The valuation is either 1 if it's a good match or 0 if it's a bad match. Consumers ex ante do not know exactly their realized valuation V. They need to search in depth to figure out. And their demand is unit, right? They only need one product. And finally, consumers are heterogeneous in terms of their match likelihood for the two products. Essentially, there are two different types of consumers. I'm going to call them type F, small f consumers, and type T consumers. First, I would like to draw your attention to the first column on this table, which is type F consumers. I'm going to assume that the entire population size has been normalized to be 1, and there are alpha fraction of type F consumers. And type F consumers' likelihood to find product F, the first party product, to be a good match is given by row H. And row H is higher than row L, which is the likelihood for type F consumers to find type T a good match. Okay, I'm going to stop here and summarize type F consumers. First of all, both types of products, F and T, could be good match for type F consumers. It's just that for type F consumers, F product is more likely to be a good match. Reversely, now I want you to look at the last column, where type T consumers population size is 1 minus alpha. And type T consumers are more likely to find product T to be a good match with probability row H. And type T consumers with probability row L, which is a smaller likelihood, will find product F to be a good match. And this slide basically lists all the major assumptions of my model. Next, I'm going to show you the process with which consumers engage in their search behavior. First, Bobby types in the keyword in Amazon.com, search query, right? Let's say I type in a coffee mug, okay? Once I type in coffee mug, 2 products will be simultaneously displayed on the web page. Product 1 with price P1 and a very short product description, and product 2 with P2 and a very short product description. Now, in this stage, I have learned the prices and the match probabilities, row H and row L. However, those short product description does not give me certainty. In other words, I need to search more to find out whether or not product 1 or product 2 will be exactly a good match for me or not. And therefore, I start my actual search, right? The second stage, the search stage. I'm going to assume, following the traditional assumption in the search literature, I'm going to assume that the first search is free. In other words, it's not very costly for me as a consumer to start searching the first product, okay? So I'm going to click in the first product webpage. I'm going to read the detailed product information, read the consumer reviews, and so on and so forth. And then I will be able to learn my realized valuation V1. Okay, I'm consumer I. Now, at this stage, I have the following trade-off. I can either stop searching, and then I decide whether or not I want to buy product 1, or just completely quit. or I can choose to continue to search product 2. If I choose to continue to search product 2, I now have to incur a search cost, CI. Just to simplify the analysis, I'm going to assume that CI follows a uniform distribution between 0 and capital C. In other words, capital C, the higher the letter capital C is, the more heterogeneous consumer search costs are. If I decide to search product 2, I'm going to click into product 2's webpage and then read the detailed product information and learn my actual realized valuation for product 2, which is given by V2. Now, at that stage, I have the following 3 options. I can buy product 1, I can buy product 2, or I can buy neither. I can completely exit the market. So this completes my modeling setup. Now I'm going to start talking about my results. I will start with the simpler case where the commission rate set by the platform is exogenously given. And my justification for this is that in the short run, Amazon, JD.com will be unlikely to change their commission rate. Okay. I've seen a question: are the probabilities of matching exogenous? Yes, the probabilities of matching. To what extent? This probability, row H and row L are exogenously given. Yes. Okay. Perfect. I'm gonna move on. Please note that now the commission rate is exogenously given. Okay. So think about this as 15% at Amazon.com, for example, right? Now, the platform knows a consumer's type, whether a consumer is F type or T type, from their individual purchase histories or browsing history, and personalize search rankings based on his or her type. Without search neutrality, let us all think about what the platform will do, right? The platform will obviously chooses the search ranking to maximize its own profit. If commission rate R is reasonably small, which probably holds in reality, right? Because if commission rate R is too high, then none of the third-party sellers will be willing to sell on Amazon.com, right? For example. Then the platform has very strong self-preferencing incentive. As a result, the platform will make its own first-party product F prominent for both types of consumers. As you can see from the table on the left lower part of this slide, right? The first place when consumers search, regardless of whether they're F type or T type, will both be the first-party product F. And the second place search results will be the third-party products. With search neutrality, search rankings by law, right, have to be purely based on relevance. In other words, self-preferencing is prohibited. As a result, I want everybody to look at the right table, where for type F consumers, the first place, the more prominent place will be F product. But for type T consumers, the first place, the more prominent place will be occupied by third-party product, right? Product T. All right, the game sequence goes as the following. Given the commission rate R, the first party and third parties sellers simultaneously choose their prices PF and PT. And then the first party seller, the platform, will personalize consumer search rankings depending on whether or not search neutrality is on and off. And in the last stage, consumers make search and purchase decisions, and both types of sellers' profits are realized. Next, I wanted to highlight the impact of search rankings. First, I'm going to show you the result that whether or not a product is displayed in the first place has important implications on this focal product's demand. In particular, the so-called first place, I'm going to label it as a prominent product, right? More prominent product. We have shown that prominence will increase a product's demand, which should not be surprising to anybody here, right? Because consumers typically start search from the first spot, and then this first spot as a prime location in the real estate, if you will, right, has given the underlying product an advantage, right? And this advantage increases its demand by making the demand more inelastic, okay? And this result is critically dependent upon the assumption that consumers observe prices before they even start their search. Okay, with this background knowledge, now we can see that if a seller is displayed at a prominent position, then this seller tends to set higher prices. A question, please.
Yeah. Does the third-party seller have an option in the strategy space apart from varying the prices? For instance, do you maybe here or in an extension consider the possibility of another platform or the third party going direct?
Excellent question. Excellent question. The short answer is that in this paper, the outside option has been, for the third-party sellers, has been normalized to 0. If there are truly viable competing platforms, then the results that I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes will be weakened, but they are not going to be completely gone, because the other platform also has incentives to self-preference its own products or services.
Okay, one more question, and this may be relevant later on. The third parties are assumed to be firms or individuals. That's from a risk aversion kind of point of view.
I'm sorry, could you please say that again? I just heard like certain regions. Is that?
Oh, no, the third party sellers.
Yes.
Because when you see probabilities in the model, I was just naturally wondering if there would be a role played by risk aversion. And for that, if they're firms or individuals that we're talking about, the third parties, because you can have people selling their products, or you can also have, let's say, firms selling their products.
Oh, I see. I see. Okay. So this model, right? This model is more applicable if we are thinking about third-party sellers to be relatively powerful national brands. Okay. Such as like Procter & Gamble or Unilever.
Okay.
Yeah. Terrific. Thanks for the question. Now let me move on. I'm going to show you the result without search neutrality. Okay. Now the government is completely hands off, right? So now what happens? I can see that in equilibrium, the platform always puts its own product F in the more prominent position for both types of consumers, right? For type F and type T. And to take advantage of its more prominent position, we can see that the platform will charge higher prices for its own products as compared to third-party sellers' products. Now, both sellers' prices will be lower if the third-party product can match with more consumers, right? So think about if the quality and the match probability of Procter & Gamble, excuse me, will be higher, then both Amazon and P&G will have to lower their prices, okay? This is the first set of results. And this is without search neutrality, right? Without search neutrality. Now let's think about what happens if there is search neutrality, where Amazon is forbidden to self-preference its own product F. In this case, we can see that in equilibrium, what happens is that Amazon can only display its own product F in a prominent position for type F consumers because of the law, right? The higher relevance dictates that the first place occupied by product F can be only observable for type F consumers. For type T consumers, search neutrality leads to the display of type T product. In other words, in a more prominent position, each type of consumers are seeing their more preferred, in probability, their more preferred, more relevant products. Now, I want you to think about what is going through Amazon's mind or Apple's mind, Google's mind. Those first-party platforms have the following trade-off. They can either charge a high price to extract more surplus from type F consumers, right? Where those type F consumers have seen the first-party product in a more prominent position, and they are more likely to find the more prominent product to be a good fit, versus charge a low price to invite type T consumers to search product F. And when both types of consumers are relatively evenly distributed, right? That's the reason why this model applies to major third-party sellers instead of like smaller individual sellers, right? So when this parameter alpha is somewhere in between, in other words, consumers more or less have equal preferences towards the two products, first-party versus third-party products, then what happens in equilibrium is that both first-party sellers and third-party sellers will increase their prices to focus on extracting their own targeted consumer surplus, okay? Instead of competing really aggressively in prices to invite more searches. Essentially, what this result means is that the policy of search neutrality actually leads to increased equilibrium prices. Specifically, I want to elaborate on the intuition a little bit. Specifically, I want you to think about the situation without search neutrality, right? Without search neutrality, after the third party's product price has been set, it will be likely made non-prominent for most consumers due to the self-preferencing incentive by the underlying platform. Anticipating that its own product will be made non-prominent, what will the third-party seller do? The third-party seller has strong incentives to reduce price to invite consumers to search. And this incentive to reduce its price has intensified pricing competition. However, with search neutrality, right? Excuse me, with search neutrality, third parties' product has been made prominent to type T consumers, and this has been guaranteed. As a result, third-party sellers can in fact increase their price to extract those targeted consumer surplus, and as a result, alleviate the pricing competition between the third-party sellers and the first-party seller. Now, essentially, the key underlying trade-off is between search neutrality and price competition. With search neutrality, fewer consumers will search the non-prominent product due to its lower match likelihood and their higher prices as compared to the situation without search neutrality, okay? Now, just to summarize our results, I'm showing you this table where we compare the welfare impact of search neutrality. We can see that with search neutrality, search relevance is higher. Higher search relevance hurts the platform because the platform can no longer display its own product in a more prominent position across the board. However, higher search relevance benefits both third-party sellers as well as consumers. However, Higher search relevance also leads to weakened price competition. And this weakened price competition benefits the platform as well as third-party sellers. And the higher price, right, weakened price competition has hurt the consumers. Just to sum up, right, we find that search neutrality can actually harm consumers if a significant amount of consumers are type T consumers. In other words, a significant amount of consumers will find the third-party products to be a good match. And also, the search neutrality can actually benefit the platform if there are a non-trivial amount of consumers who inherently prefer first-party products. Finally, in totality, search neutrality will benefit third-party seller when commission rate R is exogenously given. Okay, when commission rate R is exogenously given. I've seen another question. Is the price of the same product, same brand, different for two sets of consumers? Is the price of the same product, same brand, different for two sets of consumers?
Maybe.
Good question. The short answer is no. The prices will be the same for the same product, okay, for the same product across two different types of consumers. It's just that their location, whether or not they occupy the more prominent position or not, will be different. Okay, good question. Let me move on. Okay, I have a couple of minutes. So let me just very quickly move on to the situation where the commission rate is actually endogenously determined, right? This commission rate R, in the long run, the platforms are more likely to adjust the commission rate in the long run, right? And briefly, the game sequence goes as follows. The platform decides its commission rate percentage R first, and then third party decides whether or not to join the platform. If it decides to join the platform, it has to incur an entry cost, which is given by the letter E, which is randomly drawn from a density function F. And intuitively, a higher commission rate R will tend to reduce third-party sellers' entry incentives. Now, if this third party decides to enter the game, then this game is exactly the same as what we have just talked about in the last 40 minutes or so. If the third party seller decides to stay out of the platform, then the platform becomes a monopoly. Its own first party product is made prominent to all consumers. Okay, stopping here. A question, please.
Why do you have a probabilistic fixed cost of entry? I don't understand that.
Oh, so this is just to show the situation that some of the sellers have different entry costs than others. In other words, this is essentially to respond to your earlier question. This assumption is aimed to characterize the situations that different sellers face different outside options.
Oh,
if you think about,
I guess you will relate. I guess the outcome would be that only a certain type of sellers would enter. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct. Only sellers with relatively low entry costs will enter the market, will enter the platform. And that's endogenously determined, right? That depends on the commission rate R. If R is fairly high, then pretty much every third-party seller will be endogenously entering the platform. But if the commission rate is fairly, if the commission rate is fairly high, then very few third-party sellers will enter the platform. But if R is very low, then pretty much everybody will enter the market.
And I guess so then I guess in equilibrium, E would be kind of decided by the platform. Is that right?
Exactly. That your intuition is perfect. That's exactly true. And we want to capture that endogenously determined outcome.
Okay, thank you.
Terrific. Okay. Very good. We're right on time. I just have a couple of slides. 2 more slides. Now let's think about the situation after commission rate R is endogenously considered. We have found out that search neutrality can make third-party seller and consumers worse off. Why is that? Because now the platform has its ability to manipulate the commission rate R. We find out that the presence of search neutrality incentivizes the platform to block third-party sellers' entry by raising the commission rate R. And this completely goes against the original intention of IIMA, right? This American Innovation Information Competition Online Act, right? And when will this happen? This will happen when the match likelihood of row H, so even a good match likelihood, row H, is fairly low. It's less than 50%. And row H and row L are fairly close together. Those are the conditions under which search neutrality will make both third-party seller as well as consumers worse off. Now, if you think about the trade-off the platform is taking into account, right? The platform has the following trade-off. First, the disadvantage of inducing third-party entry is the following, right? Which is the platform has to lower its commission rate R enough so that third-party seller can overcome its entry cost, right? So that's the disadvantage of inducing third-party entry. But the advantage of inducing third-party entry is that now consumers have more choices to search, and possibly consumers have more purchases made on the platform so that the platform can collect more commission revenue, right? It turns out that with search neutrality, the pros, right, the advantage of inducing third-party seller entry on the platform is fairly weak, because with search neutrality, relatively few consumers will search the now more expensive, non-prominent product. As a result, the second bullet point here, the pros, the magnitudes of the pros will be fairly low. Relatively speaking, the cons are more prominent, okay? So that the platform has to really lower its commission rate, okay? So that the third-party sellers can actually overcome the entry cost to join the platform. As a result, right, the platform has very few incentives to accommodate seller entry. It has very strong incentives to block the entry of third-party sellers. All right, again, this slide, I really wanted to highlight one thing that Senator John Kennedy said, right? I'm gonna repeat what he said. He said, the American Innovation and Choice Online Act would help offer consumers more options at competitive prices from business online. And we have shown that both of those two statements could be wrong. With search neutrality, consumers could be facing fewer options at higher prices. Okay. Now, this is my second to the last slide. I wanted to highlight a couple of interesting future extensions, future directions, okay? They are not the extension of this paper. The first future direction is to consider multiple third-party sellers. We've had this great question earlier in this presentation that, what about differentiated sellers, differentiated third-party sellers, right? Some of them are national brands, they have more resources. Others are smaller, private, or maybe even individual sellers. And the strategic capabilities of those two different types of third-party sellers will be very different. So it'll be really interesting to study the interaction between first-party sellers and differentiated third-party sellers. Second, I'm sure all of us are aware of the fact that when you type in coffee mug on Amazon.com, right? Not only do you see organic search results, you also see some sponsored ad, right, displayed at the top of the page. Now, I think it will be fascinating to study the interaction between sponsored ad listing and organic search results. Finally, let me conclude. In this paper, I've studied the competition between first-party seller and the third-party seller. We find that on online retail platforms that can personalize consumer search rankings, the policy of search neutrality, which bans the platform self-preferencing, may actually have unintended consequences. First, this policy of search neutrality can weaken price competition between the first-party seller and the third-party sellers. Secondly, this can actually sometimes prevent the entry of third-party sellers by inducing the platform to increase its commission rate. This is the first set of results. The second set of results are such that the policy of search neutrality can actually harm consumers and third-party sellers despite its good intention to protect those more vulnerable entities against dominant retail platforms. And finally, I want to argue that I think policymakers, right, in the US, in emerging markets like India and China, and in relatively more developed economies like US, they should really carefully evaluate search neutrality's unintended strategic consequences before implementing them in large scale. Okay, thank you. I'm going to stop here, and I'll be happy to take some more questions if there are any.
Awesome. I see one question from Anshuman. Maybe I can ask his question. Anshuman, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Zhou. So I wanted to ask is, so since we have been talking about one third-party seller, so my first question is, are the two situations equivalent, where in one case you have one third-party seller with a high probability, and in the other case you have multiple third-party sellers with individually low probabilities, but a combined high third-party probability?
Let me rephrase your question just to make sure I have fully understood, right? So you are saying what happens if we have multiple third-party sellers, and some of the third-party sellers have relatively low?
No, so in your analysis, you said, so you took a particular alpha probability for the third-party sellers, right? So what I'm asking is, are those two situations equivalent, where in one case you have one third-party seller with a considerably higher alpha, that's a good number of consumers prefer that product, and the other case where there are multiple third-party sellers who individually have low alphas, but the combined value is good enough to counter the alpha of the first-party seller?
I think this is a really good question. I have to think more about it to give you the more accurate answer. I can give you my conjecture right now. I think my conjecture right now is yes. I think those two situations seem to be strategically equivalent.
Thank you. And the second question is, so you mentioned a cost in your original diagram. You mentioned that there is a cost of going to the second listed product, which is the third party product. So as we increasingly go on to the further down the list, does this cost increase linearly, or do you think the cost increases exponentially? That is it very difficult to have a customer reach the fourth or the fifth result?
Very good question. I love it. In reality, I can tell you the search cost will increase exponentially, non-linearly, right? Because cognitive fatigue, cognitive capacity constraint, right? So in reality, yes, the search cost will further increase as consumers, as we search more options. Now, in the literature, generally speaking, we make the assumption of linear search costs just to simplify the analysis. I think if, for example, if you introduce some sort of a quadratic search cost, right, a convex search cost, the model, I would say the model is probably still solvable if we only have 1, 2, 3 products. But if we have like n products, and you also want to have non-linear search costs, then the math will be very messy. We might not be able to get closed form solutions.
I think it would be wiser to simply ignore the higher terms, because the cost would be so high that nobody would reach that portion. Is that a fair assumption?
So I think whether or not that will happen, will be endogenously determined in equilibrium, right? So in other words, we don't want to simply just assume that will happen in equilibrium. I would prefer to see it to occur organically on the equilibrium path.
And just one follow-up question. So you mentioned, you took the example of a coffee mug, but could you give us some insight on what kind of products do you think what category of products do you think would be most applicable on a marketplace like Amazon for this analysis?
I want us to think about products that need some deliberation before consumers can figure out whether or not it's a great fit for them or not, right? So for example, let's think about consumer electronics. Let's think about some nutritional supplements, right? So let me just take nutritional supplements as an example, okay? We have two different types of vitamin C's, let's say, okay? One is, or glucosamine. One is a better fit for me because I'm allergic to seafood, okay? The other is, has seafood in it. So I really have to read the detailed in-depth consumer reviews to realize that, okay, one will be a good fit for me, the other will not. So something like that. So, and let me clarify, because I think this is a really relevant question. I don't claim that this applies to all the categories. Specifically, I want you to all think about, for example, certain categories in CPG, like men's hair shampoo, okay? For example, if consumers have relatively flat preferences in the sense that I don't really care, I use brand A or brand B, right? Then in that case, I'm not gonna search, right? I just pick the first one, for example, if their prices are all, more or less close to each other. So that's one thing that I wanted to clarify. In other words, if consumers have really displayed relatively indifferent preferences towards the two different competing products, then this model probably doesn't apply. On the other hand, for any new products, okay, for any new products in the new product category, this model really applies. Because for any new products, I'm going to assume that consumers will have to read the detailed product description before they can figure out whether or not the underlying underlying product is a good fit or not.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I see other questions. Please go ahead.
Nikita, you can please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Professor Anuj. Thank you, Professor Zhou, for the great talk. So I had a question regarding third-party sellers and when third-party sellers become more than one. So in your model, we consider one third-party seller, right?
That's
so
right.
If there are more third-party sellers, and let's assume apart from P&G, there is Kellogg's and let's say other such players, then I'm assuming that there would be competition amongst them also. So
That's
when
right.
a government would say that search neutrality is, they sort of implement search neutrality, then a single third-party seller might not move to a position of prominence by default, right? Because he has other third-party sellers in place to compete with. Right, because it won't automatically put the third-party seller in a prominent position for the 1 minus alpha share of consumers, because he's also competing with the rest of the third-party sellers. So would that change the results in some way? Because I feel that.
So the short answer, it will not substantially change the results, and I will give you the intuition as follows, right? Suppose let's just assume there are two third-party sellers, right? As you pointed out, P&G and Kellogg, let's say P&G and Unilever.
Mm-hmm.
Now, instead of alpha versus 1 minus alpha distribution of consumer segments, now we have 3 consumer segments, right? Essentially, alpha fraction of consumers who are more likely to find product F a good match, and then 1 minus alpha divided by 2, right? who will find, P&G to be a good fit, better fit, and 1 minus alpha divided by 2 to find Unilever to be a good fit, right? And so, and also, if you think about it, without search neutrality, Amazon still has incentives to put its own products in all 3 types of consumers' prominent position, right? Because Amazon really want to occupy that prime locational spot. So in other words, the strategic incentives that the 3 different types of players, first party, third party, as well as consumers, the strategic incentives persist. It's not, of course, the magnitude, like to what extent search neutrality will increase prices, that will be different. But qualitatively, the results should still continue to hold.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. I think that answers my question.
Thank you for the very good question.
I know we are out of time. Actually, can we take one last question from Sai?
Sure. I have one suggestion, sir, along with the question. One is probably considering the recent practices as well. You can probably take in third party seller to be selling to the platform, because ultimately platform needs to procure it from somewhere. Then probably the third party seller being worse off might not happen, whereas consumers can get even worse off. That was my first point. The second point, the question is more generic from a practitioner's point of view. So if I'm a policymaker, do you think commission curves might make more sense in the looking at the model rather than having search neutrality?
Let me just clarify. So first of all, thank you for your first suggestion. The first suggestion essentially is to say that let's consider not only a commission type of interaction between the platform and the seller, but also from a traditional channel perspective, right? So the retailer, the platform, buys in bulk from the third-party seller, which is a wholesaler essentially. Thank you. I think it will be interesting to study the dual channeling context. And I didn't quite follow the second question. Can you please, elaborate it a little further?
Considering the recent policies and with food aggregators in India as well, can we look at a context where commission curves might make more sense from a policy perspective rather than search neutrality?
Interesting. So you're saying, look, instead of implementing search neutrality, let's put a cap on the commission rate R, right?
Yes.
This is really interesting. Let's put a cap on R. Let's think about it, okay? I'm just gonna reason it on the fly, okay? So suppose the government of India says, okay, Amazon.com in India, you cannot charge a commission rate higher than 12%, okay? And suppose this actually bites, right? This is a binding constraint, if you will. So it's a fairly sort of low commission rate. Suppose that's the case. Then let's think about who will enter, right? So a lot of third-party sellers, because of the low commission rate, would enter the market.
And
then
price competition.
Right, the price competition will be more intense, even with the first-party sellers. So in that sense, consumers will be better off. I completely agree with you. However, think about what Amazon will do. Now that you told Amazon, please lower your commission rate, okay? Now, what Amazon will do is that for all of the new entrants, all of those third-party sellers, for all the products, Amazon is going to make them in a non-prominent position. In other words, Amazon has even stronger incentives to engage so-called self-preferencing behavior by putting its own products ahead of all the other competitors, right? So the short answer is that, does restricting our commission rate work? The answer is yes, to some extent. If we really care about consumers, that's a great idea. But that policy will come at the expense of third-party sellers, because Amazon is still going to continue to profit more from the so-called self-preferencing behavior. I hope this answered your question.
Yes, yes, surely, Professor.
Thank you.
Awesome. That was an interesting talk. Thank you once again, Bobby, for taking out time. I know, as you mentioned, this is a crazy semester for you, at least the first term, but you still took out time to be with us. Really, really appreciate it, and hope to see you sometime in a physical conference as well. Thanks a lot once again.
So before everybody goes, let me just take one moment to thank you all for being here. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I also wanted to say that I think currently the economics of platforms is a really fascinating field. There are so many changes, right? You know, constantly. We have iOS system, we have Google, we have Amazon, you know, and I encourage all of us to explore different topics in this field. Once again, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Bobby. And thank you everyone for taking out time. See you in the next seminar. Thanks a lot.
See you all. Bye.
Thank you.